Time is supposed to bury secrets, but on this coast, the tide always brings the truth back to shore. After nearly 3 decades away, a chance encounter with the people next door revealed the dark history my wife tried desperately to leave behind in the sand. I'm finally uncovering the betrayal she thought was forgotten, proving that some secrets never truly stay buried. I need you to understand something before I go any further. 26 years is not a number. It's a texture. It's the specific weight of a hand you've held so many times you could find it in a pitch-black room by scent alone. It's the sound of someone breathing beside you at 3 in the morning. A sound so familiar it becomes silence. That's what I had. Or what I thought I had. And I want you to hold on to that feeling, that warm, settled, safe feeling, because I'm about to show you exactly how it curdles slowly over the course of one single spring, until nothing about my life looked the way I thought it did. Let me take you back to the beginning because you need to understand what we were before I show you what we became. I met Margaret when I was 22 years old, working a summer job at a hardware store 2 towns over from here. She walked in looking for a specific kind of paint, something for a boat her father was restoring, and she argued with me for 10 minutes about whether the color she wanted actually existed. She was right, by the way. Did exist. I just hadn't stocked it yet. I married a woman who was right about almost everything, which made the one enormous thing she was wrong about, the one thing she hid, feel even more impossible to accept when it finally surfaced. I remember the early days of our courtship the way you remember weather, not events. Long drives with the windows down. Her laugh carrying out over the water when we'd sneak onto the pier after closing hours. She talked about her childhood freely, or so I thought. Her father's boat, her mother's garden, the summer spent barefoot on this exact stretch of coastline. She mentioned a best friend from those years exactly once early on in passing, a girl named Elise who she said had moved away with her family a long time ago and they'd simply lost touch the way teenage friendships sometimes do. I remember thinking nothing of it at the time. It was one sentence in 100 conversations, easy to forget, easy to file away. Looking back now, I can see the shape of what she left out, the careful editing she must have been doing even then, 22 years old and already skilled at building a version of her life that had a door lock somewhere in the back that she never let me approach. We built our whole life together starting on this coast. We got engaged on that beach, down near the rocks where the tide pools form at low water. We got married on that same stretch of sand, barefoot, her mother crying into a handkerchief, my best man forgetting the rings in his jacket pocket back at the house, so that for 3 surreal minutes the whole ceremony paused while he sprinted up the dune in his good shoes. We laughed about that for years afterward. It became one of those stories a marriage collects. A small stone you pick up and turn over at anniversaries, at dinner parties, at quiet moments when someone asks how you two met and got married. I thought I knew every stone in that collection. I did not know there was an entire riverbed hidden beneath it. We left this town not long after the wedding. Margaret wanted to go, she said, for opportunity, for a fresh start, for the kind of career she couldn't build in a small coastal town where everyone still remembered you as a teenager. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? We built a life somewhere else, good jobs, 2 children who are grown now with their own families, a mortgage we eventually paid off, a whole quarter-century of ordinary, beautiful, uneventful days. I remember our daughter's first steps in a kitchen 400 miles from here. I remember our son's graduation, Margaret sobbing into my shoulder with a pride so genuine I could feel it in my own chest. Through every single one of those days, my wife carried something inside her that I never once saw, never once suspected, because she had gotten so good at holding it that it no longer even looked like weight. Just looked like her. We moved back in early spring, the year our youngest finally settled into her own place and the house felt too big and too quiet for just the 2 of us. The house we bought still smelled like salt and old wood, like it had been waiting for us the whole time we were gone. Margaret cried when she saw the porch. Real tears, the kind that catch in your throat before they hit your eyes. She kept saying, "It's exactly the same," running her fingers along the railing like she was checking it was real. I believed every bit of that emotion. I want you to know that. I wasn't a fool walking into this blind. I was a husband who trusted his wife completely, and that trust is the very thing that made what came next feel like the floor dropping out from under a house I thought had a foundation poured decades deep. The first few weeks were soft. Unpacking boxes, finding the same creak in the 3rd stair, waving at neighbors we didn't recognize anymore. driving past the old diner that had somehow survived 26 years and a dozen different owners without ever changing its sign. The town had grown a little, changed its skin, added a coffee shop where the video rental store used to be, but the bones were the same. Margaret was different, though not in a way I could name at first. She'd go quiet near the water. She'd stand at the edge of our yard where the grass gives up and the sand takes over, and she'd just look. Not at anything in particular. Just look, like she was listening for something underneath the sound of the waves. Something only she could hear. I told myself it was nostalgia. 26 years is a long time to be away from the place you grew up. The place you fell in love in. The place where we said our vows barefoot with sand between our toes. Of course she'd feel something standing there again. Of course a person gets quiet in front of the ocean that raised her. I filed it away under sentiment and didn't think much more of it. Not yet. Not until the day the moving truck 2 doors down finally emptied itself out and an older woman with silver hair walked up our driveway holding a pie like it was an offering to something she wasn't sure deserved one. I remember the exact moment because it's the moment everything started tilting, slow at first like a boat taking on water you don't notice until your shoes are wet. Her name was Ruth. Maybe 70 years old, with eyes that looked like they'd done a lot of watching in their time, the kind of eyes that have learned patience the hard way. She introduced herself warmly enough, said she and her late husband had lived here decades ago, moved away for a while, and had just come back to settle into the house that used to belong to her mother. Small talk. Coffee. The kind of afternoon that should have meant nothing at all. But when Margaret walked into the kitchen and saw her, something happened to my wife's face that I had never seen in 26 years of marriage. It wasn't surprise. Surprise is quick, it flashes and resolves. This was different. This was the look of someone watching a ghost walk through a wall in broad daylight. Margaret's hand found the counter behind her like she needed something solid to hold on to. Her knuckles going white against the granite. Ruth's expression did something too. A tightening around the mouth, a stillness that felt rehearsed, like she'd imagined this exact moment 100 times in the shower, in the car, in the quiet hours before sleep, and was disappointed to find it as bad as she'd feared it would be. Margaret, Ruth said. Just her name. Not hello. Not nice to meet you. Just her name, low and flat, like a door closing somewhere deep inside a house you didn't know had that many rooms. I laughed it off, the way you do when you sense tension you don't understand and want to smooth it over before it becomes something you have to deal with. I made some joke about small towns and old friends. Margaret recovered fast, faster than I expected actually, which should have told me something right there. Should have told me that this recovery was a practice motion, a muscle she'd trained over decades. She smiled, said of course it had been so long, wasn't it funny how the world worked, small world, small town. Ruth left not long after, the pie sitting untouched on our counter, and Margaret didn't mention it again for 3 days, until I finally threw the pie away myself because it had started to go soft at the edges, and something about that felt symbolic even then, though I couldn't have told you why. That night, lying in bed, I asked Margaret how she knew Ruth. She said they'd gone to school together. Ages ago. Barely knew each other really. Lost touch the way everyone does after high school. Her voice was even. Practiced. I know now that a lie told with a steady voice is more dangerous than one that trembles, because the trembling ones are still fighting to become true, and the steady ones have already won that fight a long time ago, somewhere in the private architecture of a person's mind where they've rehearsed the lie so many times it no longer feels like lying at all, it just feels like the story. I let it go. That's the part one have to live with if I'm honest with you. How easily I let it go. Because I loved her, and because 26 years builds a kind of architecture in your mind where certain rooms are simply never questioned. You don't check the foundation of a house you've lived in for decades. You just trust it's holding you up, the same way you trust the floor beneath your feet without ever once testing whether it would hold if you jumped. But the tide doesn't care about your architecture. The tide comes in whether you're ready or not. Over the following weeks, small things started surfacing, the way things do after a storm. A shard here, a splinter there. Nothing that means much on its own, but together forming the outline of something buried. I noticed Margaret avoided walking past the Delacroix house, taking the long way around even when it meant an extra 5 minutes on foot. I noticed she started driving a different route to the grocery store, one that added 10 minutes and looped past the old lighthouse instead of straight down Ocean Street. I noticed that whenever Ruth's name came up at the community potluck, in the mouths of other neighbors reminiscing about the old days, Margaret's fork would pause halfway to her mouth, just for a second, just long enough for someone watching closely, And I was watching closely now, whether I wanted to admit it or not, to see the flicker of something like fear cross her face. Fear. My wife. Afraid of an old woman with silver hair and a pie recipe. It didn't make sense, and the not making sense of it kept me up at night more than any explanation could have. There was one evening, maybe 3 weeks after we'd moved back, when I ran into an old classmate of Margaret's at the gas station, a man named Peter who used to fish these waters with his father. He recognized me from the wedding photos he swore he still had somewhere in a box. We got to talking, easy conversation at first, and I mentioned almost casually that we'd met our new neighbor Ruth. Peter's face did the same thing everyone's face had started doing by then. That small involuntary flinch, like touching something hotter than expected. He said, careful now, choosing his words the way people choose footing on wet rocks. You know Margaret and Ruth's daughter used to be thick as thieves back in school. Real shame what happened. And then, like he'd caught himself saying too much, he changed the subject to the price of gas and told me to give Margaret his best. Before he drove off though, he said one more thing, almost an afterthought, that stuck with me for days. There was a boy involved too, if I remember right. Danny something. Local kid. Always figured that was half the story nobody ever told right. A boy. A name even half remembered. It was the first real thread. And I pulled at it the way you can't help pulling at a loose thread even when some part of you knows the whole sweater might come apart. I started asking around carefully, the way you do when you're not yet ready to admit to yourself that you're investigating your own marriage. I talked to the man who ran the hardware store, who'd lived here his whole life and remembered my father-in-law's boat paint order from decades ago without needing to check a record. I mentioned Ruth Delacroix, said we'd met her, nice woman. His face changed too. Not dramatically. Just a slight tightening, the same tightening I'd seen on Ruth herself. The same tightening I was starting to recognize as the town's collective way of stepping carefully around something painful. Delacroix, he said, like he was tasting the name to see if it had gone bad. Yeah, that family's been through it. Terrible thing, what happened to their daughter? Their daughter. He didn't say more. Change the subject fast, the way people do when they realize they've said too much to someone who doesn't already know the ending. I stood there in the aisle with a box of nails in my hand, and I felt something cold move through my chest, slow like water finding a crack in a hull, spreading before you even know the leak exists. I went to the library the next day, told myself I was just curious, just filling in the gaps of a town's history the way any new resident might. The librarian, a woman younger than me who'd clearly heard the story secondhand a dozen times, pulled up old newspaper archives on the computer without me even having to ask directly. An article from 26 years ago. A headline that made my stomach drop before I'd even finished reading it. Local teenager Elise Delacroix, presumed drowned in nighttime swimming accident. A grainy photograph of a girl with a wide, easy smile, maybe 19 years old, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who doesn't yet know the world can take things from you without warning. I sat there in that quiet library with the hum of the air conditioning and the smell of old paper, and I read that article 3 times, and each time I read it, I felt Margaret's name sitting somewhere just beneath the surface of the words, even though it wasn't printed anywhere on that page. There was a smaller follow-up article too, printed a week later, mentioning a candlelight vigil on the beach, a scholarship fund started in Elise's name, and one single line that made my hands go cold. Investigators noted inconsistencies in witness accounts of the evening but ultimately ruled the death accidental. Inconsistencies in witness accounts. I read that phrase over and over on the drive home. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there next to Margaret listening to that familiar breathing, that sound I'd once called silence, and for the first time in 26 years it sounded like something else. It sounded like a held breath. Like someone lying very still, very carefully, hoping the dark wouldn't notice them. I studied the ceiling for hours, replaying every quiet moment she'd spent staring at the water since we'd arrived. Every extra minute added to a grocery run. Every flinch at a stranger's name. And I understood that I was no longer simply curious. I was afraid of what I already half knew. The next morning I walked down to the beach alone, before Margaret woke up, my feet finding the cold sand in the gray early light. The tide was going out, dragging long ribbons of foam back into itself, and I stood where our wedding had been, where I'd promised her forever with sand between my toes and no idea, none at all, that forever might already be sitting on top of something buried decades deep. I looked toward the Delacroix house, its windows catching the early light, And I saw Ruth standing on her own porch, wrapped in a cardigan against the morning chill, watching me the way you watch someone you've been waiting for. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just lifted one hand slow and beckoned me toward the fence line between our properties, and I felt my feet start moving before my mind had agreed to it, because some part of me, some old animal part, already understood that once I crossed that stretch of grass, I would not be able to walk back into my old life again. I would know something, and knowing once it happens cannot be undone. I reached the fence. Ruth's eyes were wet, but her jaw was set like stone, the way people brace themselves before finally saying words they've swallowed for years. And she said the first sentence of the truth, just the first one, just enough to open the wound before she'd tell me how deep it went. 26 years, she said. And she never told you what she did to my daughter. I asked her what she meant, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. A boy's voice, not a man's. Ruth didn't answer right away. She turned and looked out at the water, the way people do when the thing they're about to say is too heavy to hand over while looking someone in the eye. She told me that Elise and Margaret had been close once, closer than sisters, inseparable through their teenage years. Right up until the summer everything fell apart. There had been a boy, she said, a local boy named Danny, the same name Peter had half remembered at the gas station, and hearing it confirmed sent a strange jolt through me, like watching two separate nightmares turn out to be the same nightmare all along. Elise had been seeing Danny secretly, Ruth explained, because he'd previously been involved, briefly and painfully, with Margaret herself the year before. Margaret had never fully let go of him, Ruth said, and when Elise and Danny fell for each other, quietly, guiltily, it broke something between the two girls that never fully healed. Margaret had known about the relationship for weeks, had been sworn to secrecy by her best friend, had smiled through it and pretended it didn't gut her every single day. That, Ruth said, was the resentment simmering underneath everything that happened next. Not just a fight between friends, but a wound that had been building for an entire summer, waiting for a night to finally split open. There had been a bonfire down at the far end of the beach, past the rocks, where the currents run strange and pull harder than they look like they should. Danny hadn't been there that particular night, called away by his own family obligations, which meant it had been just the two girls, alone with the fire and the dark and everything unspoken finally coming to the surface. Elise had gone out into the water that night, and she never came back to shore. Ruth's voice didn't break as she told me this. That was almost worse than if it had. It was the voice of someone who had said these words to herself 10,000 times in the dark, wearing the grief down into something smooth and hard, like sea glass polished by decades of tide. She said the official story, the one everyone accepted, the one printed in that library archive, was that Elise went swimming alone, that she'd had too much to drink, that it was a tragic accident and nothing more. But Ruth had never believed that story, because Margaret had been there that night. Margaret had been the last person to see her daughter alive. And Margaret had never said a single word about it, not to the police, not to Ruth, not to anyone, until the town simply stopped asking, and the silence hardened into history, and Margaret packed her bags for college 3 weeks later and never really came back, not for 26 years, not until now. I stood there at that fence with the tide pulling out behind me, and I felt my whole life reorganize itself around this new piece of information, the way a skeleton has to reset itself around a bone that's been broken and healed wrong. I thought about every quiet moment Margaret had spent staring at the water since we'd arrived. I thought about the way her hand had gripped the counter when she saw Ruth's face. I thought about a woman who could stand in our kitchen and lie to my face with a voice as steady as a held note, and I understood, with a kind of vertigo I'd never known before, that I had built an entire life, an entire love, on top of a room in her heart that I had never once been allowed to enter. I asked Ruth why she was telling me this now, after all these years of silence between the two families, after watching us move in next door without a word. She said she'd waited 26 years for Margaret herself to say something, anything, even a private apology whispered across a fence. And when Margaret didn't, when she simply avoided her, took the long way to the store, let 3 more weeks pass in silence, Ruth said something in her finally broke. Not out of cruelty, she told me. Out of exhaustion. Out of a grief so old it had calcified into something that needed air, needed daylight, needed one single person to finally know the truth of what she'd lost and how she'd lost it. She told me she used to hate Margaret, hated her with a heat that frightened her, And then over the years that hate had cooled into something quieter and sadder, a kind of permanent ache that never fully faded but had stopped burning quite so hot. Seeing Margaret again, healthy, married, happy, living an entire full life while Elise never got to live any of hers, had reopened something Ruth thought had scarred over long ago. I didn't go back into the house that morning. I couldn't. I walked the length of that beach for hours, past the rocks Ruth had mentioned, out to where the water turned dark and restless, and I tried to picture my wife as a 19-year-old girl standing exactly where I stood now, watching her best friend disappear into that same black water and choosing, in that instant or in the weeks after, to say nothing. To let a mother believe her daughter simply swam out too far. To let a town build a gentle, tragic story instead of whatever the true one was. I thought about our wedding day, our vows spoken practically on top of that very memory, and I felt something in my chest go cold and hollow like a room that's just had all its furniture removed. I thought, too, about our own children, about how Margaret had taught them to always tell the truth even when it was hard, how she'd built entire parenting philosophies around honesty, and the hypocrisy of that landed on me like a physical weight. When I finally came home, hours later, sunburned and hollowed out, Margaret was sitting on the porch steps waiting for me, and I understood immediately that she knew. She knew I'd been to the fence. She knew Ruth had finally said it, after 26 years of silence between two women circling each other's grief and guilt from opposite sides of a property line. Margaret's face was pale, stripped of the performance I'd watched her give 100 times since we'd arrived. This was not a steady voice waiting for me. This was something raw, something that looked, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely afraid. I sat down across from her on the porch, not beside her, deliberately not beside her, and I asked her one question. I didn't yell. I want you to understand that I didn't have the energy for anger yet. That would come later in waves the way grief does. I simply asked her what happened to Elise, and I told her I needed the whole truth this time, every piece of it, or I didn't know what would be left of us to salvage. And for the first time in 26 years of marriage, my wife told me the truth. She said they had fought that night, and yes, it had been about Danny, about the secret she'd carried for weeks pretending it didn't hurt her, about a betrayal she'd never fully forgiven even though she'd smiled through it for the sake of a friendship she didn't want to lose. She said the jealousy had been curdling in her for the entire summer. The kind of jealousy that only exists between people who love each other so fiercely, it turns sharp at the edges. She said Elise had waded out into the water angry, reckless, wanting to prove something, daring Margaret to come in after her, and Margaret had stood on the sand and watched her go, and some small, ugly 19-year-old part of her had thought, let her scare herself, let her come back cold and humbled, and had not gone in after her, had not called for help fast enough, had frozen the way people freeze in the exact moment a life is tipping toward its ending, and by the time she understood what was happening, the current had already taken Elise past the point where anyone could reach her. She told the police she'd found Elise's things on the beach after searching for her. She never told them she'd been standing right there, close enough to hear her name being called across the water. She never told them about Danny, about the fight, about the very real motive that would have painted an entirely different picture than the peaceful, accidental one the town eventually settled into. She let herself become a grieving best friend instead of the last living witness, and she carried that lie into every single year of our marriage, into our wedding on that very sand, into every quiet night I'd mistaken for peace, into every anniversary dinner where she'd smiled and toasted to 26 wonderful years while a 19-year-old girl's last moments sat locked somewhere behind her eyes. I asked her why. 26 years, and she'd never once let me carry any part of this weight with her. Never once trusted me with the heaviest thing she'd ever lived through. She said she was afraid. Afraid I'd see her differently. Afraid the whole town would see her differently. Afraid that admitting the truth would mean admitting that she could have saved Elise and chose, in one selfish, human, unforgivable second, not to. She said the lie had started small, a single omission to a police officer who never thought to ask harder questions, and then it had simply grown, the way lies do, adding a room every year until it became a house she lived inside without remembering she'd built it. She said that by the time she met me, 2 years later, the lie had already hardened into a version of herself she genuinely believed some days, and telling me the truth would have meant admitting she'd been lying not just to me, but to herself for the entirety of our relationship. I want to tell you I found some grand cinematic way to respond in that moment, But the truth is I just sat there on the step across from her as the light went orange and then gray. Two people who had shared a bed for 26 years suddenly strangers to each other in the most fundamental way. I felt anger, yes, real anger, the kind that makes your hands shake. But underneath it, quieter, was something closer to grief for the version of my marriage I'd believed in that morning, which no longer existed by that evening. What happened after that wasn't a single confrontation. It was a slow unraveling, the kind that takes weeks, not minutes. I moved into the guest room for a while. I needed distance, needed space to sit with the shape of what I now knew. Margaret didn't fight me on it. She seemed almost relieved to finally be held accountable by someone. Even if that someone was the husband she'd spent decades protecting from this exact truth. There were nights I heard her crying through the wall, quiet, careful crying, the kind you do when you've trained yourself for years not to make noise about your own pain. Part of me wanted to go comfort her. The old habit of 26 years pulling at me even then. I didn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready, and pretending otherwise would have just been one more small lie added to a pile that already felt too tall. I called our children during that stretch separately and I didn't tell them everything. Some things felt like they belonged only to Margaret and me, not something to hand down to the next generation before we'd even figured out what to do with it ourselves. But I told our daughter enough in a late-night phone call that her mother and I were going through something difficult, something old, something from before either of them existed, and that we were working through it. She asked if we were getting divorced. I told her honestly that I didn't know yet. That was the first time in the whole ordeal I said something out loud that scared me more than anything Ruth or Margaret had told me. We started seeing a therapist together about 3 weeks into that guest room stretch, a woman named Dr. Alvarez who specialized in trauma and long-buried secrets within marriages, someone Margaret found after admitting quietly that she didn't trust herself to carry this alone anymore. Those early sessions were brutal. I remember sitting in that small office with the tissue box perfectly centered on the table between us like some kind of ceasefire flag, and Dr. Alvarez asking Margaret to describe out loud in detail exactly what she remembered from that night. Margaret's hand shook the entire time. She kept apologizing mid-sentence, not to the therapist, but to me, little fragments of "I'm sorry" scattered through her account like punctuation. Dr. Alvarez gently reminded her more than once that this space wasn't for punishment, it was for truth, and I remember thinking 26 years too late, but truth all the same. Eventually, Margaret walked next door on her own without me, and sat with Ruth for 3 hours. I don't know everything that was said between them, and I've come to believe that's not mine to know. Some conversations belong only to the people who carry the grief. But I do know that Ruth had spent 26 years wanting one thing. Not revenge, not punishment, just the truth. Just an acknowledgement that her daughter's last night on this earth mattered enough to be remembered honestly. And when she finally got it, something in her seemed to exhale for the first time since I'd met her. Some old tension leaving her shoulders that I hadn't even realized was there. There was a second conversation too, one I was present for. Out on that same stretch of beach where the wedding had happened and where Elise had disappeared, the two events forever tangled together on the same sand whether we liked it or not. Margaret stood at the water's edge and said Elise's name out loud for what Ruth later told me was the first time in 26 years. She said it into the wind, into the surf, like she was finally giving the ocean back something she'd been holding onto for far too long. I watched my wife cry in a way I had never seen her cry before. Not performative, not practiced, just raw and total and long overdue. Ruth stood a few feet away, not touching her, not offering comfort exactly, just witnessing, which I understood by then was its own kind of mercy. In the weeks after that, the three of us fell into an uneasy but honest rhythm. Ruth would sometimes come by in the evenings and she and Margaret would sit on the porch and talk, not always about Elise, sometimes about ordinary things, the way people rebuild a bridge one plank at a time instead of all at once. Ruth mentioned once, almost in passing, that the scholarship fund started in Elise's name all those years ago had quietly continued, funded now mostly by strangers who'd forgotten the story behind it, still sending a local student to college every year without ever knowing the girl's name meant anything more than a plaque. Margaret asked if she could contribute to it. Ruth said yes on one condition, that Margaret write something for it, a real account, honest, of who Elise actually was, not the sanitized version the town had settled on. Margaret spent 2 weeks writing that letter. I watched her cry over it more than once, crossing out sentences that felt too easy, too forgiving of herself, starting over until it finally felt true. As for Margaret and me, I won't pretend we're the same as we were. You don't rebuild a marriage on the same foundation. Once you've discovered the foundation was never solid to begin with. What we're building now is slower, more honest, full of the kind of hard conversations we should have had decades ago. We go to counseling now, something Margaret resisted for years and finally agreed to without me even having to ask twice. Some days I look at her and still feel that old warmth, that familiar comfort of 26 years of shared life. Other days I look at her and see a 19-year-old girl standing frozen on a dark beach, and I have to remind myself that people are not only their worst moment, even when that moment is a life, even when that moment shaped everything that came after it in ways neither of us fully understood until now. I moved back into our bedroom about 2 months after the confession, not because the anger was gone, but because I'd realized staying away wasn't punishing her so much as it was punishing both of us for the same crime, one she committed and one I was choosing to extend indefinitely. We still have hard nights. There are moments when something as small as the sound of the tide through an open window makes her go quiet in a way that used to confuse me and now, painfully, makes complete sense. Here's what I've come to understand. Sitting with all of this in the months since, we like to believe that time forgives things, that enough years will wear guilt down into something manageable, something that no longer has teeth. But time doesn't forgive anything. It only waits. Every secret you bury stays exactly as sharp as the day you buried it, sitting patiently under the surface, and the tide always finds a way to bring it back to shore, whether that tide is a nosy neighbor, a chance encounter, an old newspaper archive, or simply your own conscience finally refusing to stay quiet any longer. The real betrayal was never the accident on that beach. Accidents happen. Fear happens. 19-year-olds freeze in moments that call for courage, and none of us can honestly say with certainty we'd have done differently in her place. The real betrayal was the 26 years of silence that followed. The choice, made and remade every single day, to let the people who loved her believe a gentler lie instead of trusting them with the difficult truth. It was the wedding vows spoken on top of a secret. It was every anniversary, every ordinary Tuesday, every quiet night in bed, built on a foundation that was never fully honest. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's not about revenge, and it's not really about Margaret's guilt either. It's about the quiet, corrosive cost of protecting the people we love from the truth, when what they actually needed all along was the chance to love us honestly, flaws, failures, frozen moments and all. A partnership isn't built on the absence of mistakes. It's built on the willingness to hand someone your worst moment and trust that they'll still choose to stay. Margaret never gave me that chance, not for 26 years, and in withholding it, she robbed both of us of a deeper kind of intimacy than the one we'd settled for. I think often now about Ruth, standing on that porch every morning for years, wondering if the truth would ever come. I think about how close it came to never surfacing at all. If we'd chosen a different house, a different street, if that moving truck had gone anywhere else in the world. And I think about how strange it is that the very thing Margaret spent 26 years running from was the thing that finally set her free once it caught up to her. Secrets don't preserve the people we love. They just delay the reckoning, and they make the tide, when it finally comes in, hit that much harder. If you're carrying something heavy right now, something you've convinced yourself is kinder to keep buried, I want you to think about the people standing on the shore waiting year after year for the water to finally give something back. Truth, even decades late, is still worth more than a lifetime of comfortable silence. The tide always comes in eventually. The only choice you really have is whether you bring the truth to shore yourself, or whether you let it wash up on someone else's doorstep, the way it washed up on mine.